Hi, everybody. This week, I want to offer some brief remarks on the next figure in our course, Malcolm X. Now, of course, we met Malcolm last week when we watched the documentary Malcolm X Make It Plain, and we read a pretty substantial portion of his autobiography, focusing on the years of his conversion and joining the nation, and then his break with the nation and his time on the pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia in the city of Mecca. This week, we're reading a few other texts from Malcolm. This includes his Declaration of Independence upon his break with the nation. We're reading perhaps his most famous speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, from April 1964, and his letter from Mecca, written from Mecca during his pilgrimage to that city. The benefit of looking at these texts is to get these events from Malcolm's own perspective. I mean, of course, the autobiography is also from his perspective. It's his autobiography. But as we saw last week, this work was in fact authored together with Alex Haley. So by looking at these statements and this speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, we're going directly to Malcolm himself with no mediator. And this is always a valuable thing. So let's dive in. So some remarks for you on Malcolm X. I want to start by just making a few comments about the Nation of Islam. And my goal overall today is to stitch together what we've already learned about Malcolm and what we're talking about this week with the broader themes of our course, theology of the civil rights movement, because that's what the inclusion of Malcolm here is really doing. It's serving as it did historically as well, as a contrast with the kind of mainstream of what we call the civil rights movement associated with Martin Luther King Jr., and tracing a different direction within that broad movement. So let's look at where Malcolm started. And certainly we learned a bit about this in the documentary last week, but I want to touch upon it. So the Nation of Islam, we'll see in a moment, was founded in 1930. And by the time Malcolm joined, had grown somewhat, but it grew enormously under his, I will say, leadership. He was, of course, as you know, not the leader of the movement. That was Elijah Muhammad at the time he was in it. But he was an outstanding spokesperson of the movement, and until the end, often relied upon by Elijah Muhammad to serve in that capacity. Here we have an image of some members of the Fruit of Islam, members of male men within the nation who were training in a more rigorous way than other members, and devoting themselves really fully to the principles and disciplines of the nation. So the Nation of Islam that Malcolm X joined, and which importantly was the platform from which he first spoke to the nation, the nation being the Nation of Islam, and the other nation being, of course, the United States. The NOI, as we'll call it, or the nation, was founded by Wallace Fard Muhammad in 1930. And little is known about Wallace Fard Muhammad. It is supposed by scholars that he is of Pakistani and New Zealander parents. So he was a person born in the United States from people who had emigrated to this country. And there is a question about why he chose to found the nation. And scholars have looked at this from various angles. It's simply hard to say. And this is often the case with the origin of religious movements, which take on a life very much their own as they develop. Later, he was understood by many within the nation to be God incarnate, actually to be presenting that divine principle in his person. And it wasn't until the 1950s, though, after the time of his leadership in the movement, that the message of the nation began to really spread around the nation, around the country, around the United States. And of course, that's the time that Malcolm joined the movement. Why is this movement so significant? Well, there is the historical fact that it became influential, and Malcolm X was a part of it. Also, that it's an outstanding example of a new religious movement within the United States, which has many adherents still today. Um, Historically, I would say an important feature of the movement was its adherence to the so-called one-drop rule, that any non-white non-Caucasian, non-European ancestry that a person might have makes that person black. And so there's a kind of um, clarification of white versus black. And there's a certain kind of mythology associated with that within the movement, involving a figure called Yaqub and a kind of long backstory, which we won't get into here. But practically speaking, this made it clear to members of the movement and also to those motivated by Malcolm X that white versus black, in that contest, there were far more black folks than there were white folks, globally speaking, right? And it gave confidence to people at that time, and gave them a sense of clarity of purpose. That would be my reading of the practical effect of this. It also, practically speaking, spoke to people who were dissatisfied with the NAACP, with the Urban League, and with the civil rights movement under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. People who thought this movement was, in fact, going too slow, was working too much in cooperation with government entities, which, in fact, were, at least secretly, sometimes overtly, aligned against it. People who were suspicious of the philosophy of nonviolence that we've spent a lot of time looking at in this course, not because they were interested in initiating aggression, necessarily physical aggression, but because they held that violence in the service of self-defense should not be taken off the table at a time when the very lives, as still today, of Black Americans were daily under threat. I want to put up just a few photos here. We saw in the autobiography last week how, I think we can say, how low Malcolm sank. He describes in the chapter entitled Satan in the autobiography, which was his nickname in the prison, pacing back and forth in his cell at a time when he was in solitary confinement, cursing and talking to himself. He had really hit a certain low in prison. And we see in the autobiography and in the documentary from last week how he pulled himself out of that, in large part motivated by his connection with the nation. And we see in these historical images of the Fruit of Islam, the male organization within the nation, the kind of discipline that Malcolm would then go on to practice throughout his life. And to me personally, I have to say, this is a profoundly inspiring feature of Malcolm's person and journey and practice and work. He was a person who seemed, as he put it in one point, I think it's in the Ballad or the Bullet speech, his calling card is his sincerity. He was a profoundly sincere person. And however one feels about his politics or the particular decisions that he made, I would invite you to consider simply the sincerity and the dedication of this man to the causes that he was devoted to. As there was an organization for men, Fruit of Islam, within the nation, there was an organization for women. We see that the dress of members of this organization was uniform, again expressing the great discipline that was practiced. And we see here Malcolm as he would have been. I believe this is the Chicago Temple or the New York Temple. I'm not sure which, but we see Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the movement, on the wall, or his image on the wall, and we see Malcolm interacting with people in this setting. So this is what Malcolm did. Malcolm moved around, as you saw in the documentary, and established these temples. So he was on the ground working with people. This not only had the effect of enhancing his credibility with those groups, but also of giving him a clear on-the-ground understanding of the concerns and interests and worries and hopes of people within the movement. Probably the greatest conversion, if we can call it that, the greatest draw of a new member that Malcolm occasioned during his time in the nation near the very end was Cassius Clay, whom we know as Muhammad Ali, who joined the movement in, I believe, 1963 or 64. And it was around that same time, of course, that Malcolm's own relationship with the nation was weakening. And I want to show you a few images here of himself and Elijah Muhammad and just comment a bit on that. We see in the example of Malcolm what Max Weber, the sociologist from about a century ago, would call a charismatic personality, a person who has a certain magnetism about them, whose authority comes, yes, from his position within the movement and his role as spokesperson or founder of a temple, but largely from, as we have mentioned briefly already, his sincerity, his person itself. When he stood to speak, the clarity and the reasoning and the passion with which he spoke motivated people and made them willing to sign on to what he was doing. Elijah Muhammad was in a different position in the movement at that time. He was officially, of course, the head of the movement and respected as such by Malcolm until his break with it. But he did not go out as often as Malcolm did. He did not speak in the same way Malcolm did, either with the same frequency or with the same kind of speaking that Malcolm did. And so this led, as we saw last week, to tensions between himself and Malcolm. We see in some of these images the close nature of the relationship between Elijah and Malcolm. Malcolm, of course, regarded Elijah Muhammad during his time in the movement as a father figure, having himself, Malcolm, lost his own father early in life. We also know that Malcolm truly believed, speaking of his sincerity, in the sincerity of Elijah Muhammad and in the message that he was preaching, what the messenger was saying. And so when it became known within the movement, as we learned last week, that Elijah Muhammad had been involved in relationships with certain women in his organization, and that this had led to pregnancies and the birth of children unknown to members of the movement, this hit Malcolm hard, and it led to collapse of his confidence in Elijah Muhammad. But this image in particular strikes me always. I mean, it might just be an accident of the camera, right? But the kind of deferential position of Malcolm, this tall 6'4" person, um, bowing down before the leader of the movement to which he has dedicated his life. And we see Elijah Muhammad, again, perhaps just a catch of the camera, but looking at him with a certain distance. To me, personally, this image nicely represents, I mean, if we can use such a word, I mean, tragically represents the looming break between these two figures. I wanted to say a bit more also about Muhammad Ali and Malcolm's role in that, we'll call it a conversion. Remember, at the time that Malcolm was visiting Muhammad Ali and his Muhammad Ali's famous fight was happening, and then he joined the nation, Malcolm was on the outs with the nation. This had just come after his remarks following the assassination of President Kennedy, his off-the-cuff remarks that this was a case of the chickens coming home to roost, famously, and this had served as an occasion for the head office in the nation to distance themselves from Malcolm and to silence him in his role as spokesperson for the movement for a period of time, with, it seems, likelihood that that period of time would be extended indefinitely. And so Malcolm, in seeking out the friendship and to serve as a mentor of a kind for Cassius Clay at the time, was a significant thing and undertaken really on his own initiative. If we are looking at images, but this is one that really stands out to me as well, the way he's leaning in and talking into Muhammad Ali's ear, right? He really has his ear in a certain way. This connection between himself and Muhammad Ali would do much for Malcolm when he went on his pilgrimage and was traveling in the Middle East and in Africa, because Muhammad Ali was known, and Malcolm was associated with him in people's minds. The main focus for this week, though, and I won't say much about the Declaration of Independence or the letter from Mecca, although we'll touch on the latter a bit in a few moments, is the speech, the ballot or the bullet, delivered, I believe, on April 12th of 1964. Now, if we're looking at texts that situate Malcolm in the course, this course, um, in relation to King, before him, and contemporaneous with him, and then Baldwin and Cone and Coates to follow. This is the text. This is the text where Malcolm really sets forth his own view on the matter of what is called the civil rights movement, or the struggle for racial justice in this country, independently of the nation. He had broken with the nation. He is speaking as his own person. And as you'll see as the speech begins, he seeks to clarify what's going on here, right? Why did this break happen? Is he still a Muslim? What is his position? And he devotes some space to that. It's significantly delivered just before his trip to Mecca on his pilgrimage. So he had not yet gone, and this expresses his view, again, immediately before. And the letter from Mecca suggests what he will do upon his return. The early portions of the speech, the first 3 or 4 pages, I'm very interested to hear what everyone thinks of them, because they're talking about, or Malcolm is talking about in those pages, the nature of religious belief. Is it a public affair or is it a private affair? Now, up to this point in Malcolm's life, religion had been for him, his religion, pretty much a public affair, right? I mean, he was a Muslim minister within the Nation of Islam. He continued to be here in his new organization, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, but he takes a different approach, and he's seeking here to build bridges in a way that we don't see nearly as much of in his earlier work. Whether one is a Christian or a Muslim or a person of any other faith, we will see him say in this early portion of the speech, they can work together on a practical project. And he has a name for that practical project. It is Black nationalism. He has a rather dark but very powerful observation, I think. They don't lynch you because you're Baptist. They lynch you because you're Black, right? A dark thought, but one of the many insights I would suggest to you in Malcolm's speech. The divisions religiously, in his view, were actually inhibiting progress toward common goals that would benefit the community of Black Americans, and he wanted to make that progress. He points out here, too, that Black nationalism is a movement that has worked, if we want to put it that way, on the African continent. This is a time of decolonization, right? The European powers, who had for a century, far more, dominated that continent politically, were withdrawing from it, and nations were finally gaining their independence. And how were they doing it? They were doing it through a philosophy, a social and economic philosophy of Black nationalism. Now, importantly, too, Malcolm here addresses explicitly the March on Washington, which we saw in just a couple of weeks back when we looked at Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech in the week on Birmingham and Washington. If you're still singing We Shall Overcome in 1963, or 64 in this case, there's a problem here. And I love how he puts it. And again, as I've mentioned to you, I encourage you to listen to the speech as you read it, because when you hear the applause and when you hear the specific way that Malcolm delivers these lines, it really brings to life what he did as a speaker, as a rhetorician. Another well-known line here, often repeated, is that the civil rights movement is not forceful enough. Okay, it's not willing to engage in self-defense if that involves any kind of physical violence. But he offers this line, repeats it a couple times, and just lets it sit. We're doing too much singing and not enough swinging. Right? He's swinging. He's got a few things in mind. He mentions Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali. Right. So I mean, here we have a prize fighter, a boxer, right, who is literally swinging, and he has swung his way into this championship. But if you're not, in his view, asserting yourself, standing up for yourself, then what progress is going to be made? The word that gets used later in the speech, as we know, is chump. You're a chump, right? You're being taken advantage of by, frankly, white America, which does not want to see Black Americans receive the rights that are their due, both under law and according to their human rights. Why is this not happening? This is another important feature of the speech for our purposes. He sees a government conspiracy, his term, to block rights for African Americans. Now, this sometimes involves things like smoky back rooms, as the image has it, but it's also a more open conspiracy. He names, how many of the various committee leaders in Congress and how many people are segregationists explicitly at that time, and is successful, in my view, in demonstrating that there was enough opposition, even open opposition, to the cause of racial equality on the part of people actually elected in government, to make pursuing equality through that channel not something that was promising. Of course, we did see in 1964 the Civil Rights Act, in 1965 the Voting Rights Act, but as others will help us to understand, and that's Baldwin, Cohn, and Coates, our remaining author, especially Coates, that legislation on its own, we don't need Coates to tell us, did not resolve the issues that Malcolm discusses here. One thing, a line that stuck with me, might have stood out to you as well. If you're Black, you were born in jail, Malcolm says, in the North as well as the South. Stop talking about the South. Long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're South. I think it's an important line. I mean, we sit here in, as it so happens, I'm in the state of Connecticut. That's where Albertus Magnus College is. And, being in the North, one might feel able to indulge in some kind of self-congratulatory prejudice against folks, fellow citizens in other parts of the country. Malcolm's making the point that the entire country, and this is the same point that King makes in his letter from Birmingham jail, the entire country is poisoned by racism in different ways, in different manifest forms. But as he puts it here, I think memorably, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're South, right? He's not willing to distinguish between North and South, and gives his reasons for not doing that. A really important part here as well of the speech, which I want to emphasize, is the need, as he sees it, to look beyond the United States in the fight for civil rights. Okay, the civil rights movement. Why is this not a case of human rights? Because, manifestly is a case of human rights. So why is the language of human rights not being used? This is 1964. United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, 1948 is passed. It's not the kind of, bombshell culture transformation out of the gate that we sometimes might think it was. It took decades, really, for the instruments, for the legal and organizational instruments to be put in place to really make human rights enforceable around the world. However, this discourse was readily available even before the explicit Declaration of Human Rights. And Malcolm is making the case that Black Americans, and any American who cares about justice, needs to look beyond the borders of this country and hold the United States accountable at an international level. So in all of these ways, Malcolm is, concerning the theology of the civil rights, of course, our theme, he's setting aside theological differences. He's not letting because you see his arguments here, he's not making arguments that are based on theology in any way. He's not even making arguments about, the dignity of the human person, or, agape, as King is doing. King is not citing, the Bible as a proof text and saying, because the Bible says this, we must do that. At least he's not always doing that. He's giving arguments for his view. Um, so too here is Malcolm, but he's really not making any religious argument at all. This is different from what he was doing earlier in his career, and it's something that we see right in this particular moment after his break with the nation and before his journey to Mecca. So let's talk just a bit in conclusion about that journey to Mecca and this beautiful text of the letter from Mecca that we've had assigned this week. Here we have Malcolm praying in a mosque in that region. He was met, as he describes in the letter from Mecca, as a guest of the state when it became known that he was there. He was afforded by the Saudi government every comfort and convenience. He was given a hotel suite by a certain diplomat and was really quite taken with this. Why was he taken with this? I mean, he's being shown by people of all colors and all backgrounds and all classes. His human dignity is being recognized by all in a way that perhaps he had not experienced. Certainly in the letter, he claims that this was a revelation to him and not something that he had felt before. We see him here, his tall frame towering over those with whom he's with. He was kind of a celebrity. People, as pointed out in the autobiography, I think it was, mistook him for Muhammad Ali. Thought he was Muhammad Ali, though he wasn't, but still played a role in that. And we see some other images here suggesting to me that his pilgrimage was not only a personal journey, but a very well documented, certainly a well photographed journey. We see also what is described last week in the autobiography, his visit to Ghana, where he was ceremonially received by the government there. Again, we see his height. And this led him to form, upon his return, the Organization for Afro-American Unity, which would pursue the aim of pressing human rights concerns with respect to the treatment of Black Americans, rather than framing it in terms of civil rights to be negotiated, as it were, to be secured through the government. And we have here a mural that stood out to me. Like you, I use Google, right? Look for images. But here we have a really, I think, beautiful image. We have Malcolm, a young Malcolm there on the left. We see him in that famous pose of pointing into the future, accusatory figure. We see the moon, crescent moon, symbol of Islam. And then we see here on the right, Malcolm, after his journey to the Middle East and specifically to Africa, looking not as though he's given up on his previous values and commitments, but that he's perhaps taken a new direction in relation to them. And that's what I've invited you to write about this week as you reflect on our readings from Malcolm X. How did this journey to Mecca affect Malcolm? I like that this artist has chosen to place the past Malcolm on the left of Africa and the current or future or final Malcolm on the right, showing that his journey to that continent it really is the catalyst in this change in his view. And I say change in his view, but we have on the bottom here, overlapping with both images, the famous phrase from Malcolm: "Our objective is complete freedom and justice and equality by any means necessary." And so even if his tone, his approach, his worldview, so to speak, changed as a result of this trip, his conviction concerning freedom and justice and equality did not, nor did his willingness to defend his community, perhaps by any means necessary. I really hope that you've gotten to enjoy our engagement with Malcolm in these 2 weeks. I think he's a really compelling figure and a special person to be considered in the course. I look forward to hearing your thoughts about Malcolm and wish you happy reading.